Hi everybody, welcome back to Phil 375, Philosophy and Literature. We are now into week 8, which means that we're into the second half of the course. Technically slightly less than half, so we're more than halfway through in terms of time. But we're into the second segment. So the first segment was all about reading and analysis and critique of existing philosophical literature and texts. And this second part is all about, this is the time when we get to have some fun and play with creating some philosophical literature ourselves. So we're going to be doing some writing exercises, and don't be scared by this. It's going to start very slow and gradual, and we're going to work up to writing something together. And the process by which we're going to get there, it's going to occupy the remaining 5 weeks of the term. I'll talk about the timeline and how we're going to fit everything together in just a minute. But first of all, I just wanted to talk quickly about the essays. So those of you who have submitted, awesome. I know quite a few people still have their extensions, so that's no problem at all. The turnaround time is going to be, I was just chatting with the TAs this morning, and so we agreed that we're going to try to get everything back by Monday 29th of March, which is 3 weeks from today. Those of you who are submitting a little later because you had an extension, the turnaround time will be 3 weeks from the date of submission. So everyone who's submitted their work on the original deadline will get their grades and feedback by the 29th. And everyone who's submitting a little later with an extension, it'll be 3 weeks from the submitted date. Okay, yes, the rest of the course, we are going to be doing various bits of creative work and writing practice. The eventual aim will be to create a final piece of writing. Each person will create a final piece of writing, and that will be due on the 14th of April, which is the very last day of classes. And before that, so in order to kind of get us there gradually, you're going to submit a draft piece, which will then turn into the final piece, and the draft is due on the 31st of March. So just to kind of contextualize, we are now, it's now March the 8th, so we're going to be looking over the rest of this month towards getting the first draft ready, and then the final piece with feedback and revisions, etc., will be the 14th of April, 2 weeks after that, at the very end of class. So in order to get to there, we're going to start, like I said, we're starting this small and slow, and really at this point in the course, the aim is just to play around, try some stuff out, and just don't worry about getting excellent results every time. The thing that's really important at this stage in the process of creating that final piece of writing is just to forget about the final piece of writing, if that makes sense. So you need to kind of give yourself permission to mess with stuff and just see what happens. So that's what this week is really about. So there are 5 weeks. 4 of them are going to be mostly me giving some guidance and then suggesting writing prompts that you all can kind of practice on. And the other one, which is the week in between the draft and the final version being due, that will be a week of feedback where you will all be giving feedback peer-to-peer with each other. So I'll explain in more detail, as we get there, how that part's going to work. But for this week, I'm going to give some guidance on writing philosophical literature. And the topic that I wanted to talk about this week, for our first week doing this, is getting beyond the cliché. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about cliches of philosophical literature. I've identified 4 particular ones that I wanted to address. This is not the full list, there's more, but there are 4 that I'm noticing a lot, and that I've kind of deliberately structured our text so far to kind of illustrate for us. So I'm going to talk about those, and then I'll introduce the writing prompts, the exercise for this week. And so The discussion boards this week and for the rest of the class are not going to be for discussing texts that we're set, but they're for trying out your own writing and using what we've read to kind of put some of that into practice, if that makes sense. So cliches. What is a cliche? I mean, it means something that's been done a lot of times, so many times that it's now very familiar and predictable. So what counts as a cliche is very contextually specific. So something that is a cliche now wouldn't have been a cliche when Shakespeare did it for the first time, but because it's been done so many times since then, now it's a cliche. Similarly, what's a cliche in one context might not be a cliche in another context. So something that's very cliche in philosophical literature might be actually quite surprising or unusual to see on a sitcom, for example, or romantic comedy. So cliches are, they're not necessarily things that are good or bad. They're just things that have been done a lot of times in specific contexts. And so calling something a cliche doesn't mean you can't do it. That's one thing I want to kind of stress. It just means if you do it, you want to be aware that you're playing with the cliche. And so that can involve twisting it somehow. And maybe you deploy the cliche only to break down the expectations that it creates in some way later in your piece of writing. Or maybe being meta about it, so you reflect on the cliche itself at the very same time that you use it. There are lots of ways that you can play with cliches, but the main thing is just to make sure that if you use one, you're using it with awareness and not sort of falling into the trap, which can weaken philosophical literature, of doing something that's already been done so often that it's now predictable and boring. So whatever you do, you don't want your writing to be predictable and boring. Okay, so the 4 cliches of philosophical literature that I'm going to talk about today are the fable, using a character as an obvious mouthpiece or stand-in for the author, the after-school special, and then angsty existentialism. So those are my top 4. So let's start with the fable. So now when Aesop was writing fables, that wasn't a cliche, but if we now wrote something that looked like an Aesop fable, we'd be playing into a cliche of a way of doing moral or ethical writing. So because ethics is part of philosophy, I think the fable is part of philosophical literature. But if we just write something that looks like a straight up Aesop's fable, we're going to be doing something that's pretty cliche. Now, does that mean we can't do it? No, but it means if we were going to do that, we would want to do something that showed we were aware of the cliche status of the fable. So, we might still write a cute short little story featuring animals, but maybe we have them do something that's really unexpected in the context of Aesop's morals for children. So I won't go into details of what it might be that they could do that would be really unexpected in that context, but I'm sure you can think of all sorts of different ways that could go. Another option is to use the fable or the idea of writing a story with obvious morals of the story at the end, a bit more like how Graham Priest uses it, where he obviously is telling, he's doing the fable thing where you tell the story and then here's the moral of my story. But his story has 10 morals, and his story is not like a cutesy story with animals. It's obviously very much of an adult short fiction. And the kind of morals he's trying to draw from his fable are not at all like simple ethical lessons in the way that Aesop was famous for. So Priest is kind of using the fable plus morals structure, but going way beyond the cliche of just writing another Aesop type fable. So that's another way that you can use a cliche model, but move far beyond just doing the expected thing with it. So that was the first cliche, the fable. Second cliche is writing a story where one character is obviously the mouthpiece of the author, or the stand-in for the author within the text. So now a lot of people think this is what Plato does with Socrates in a lot of his dialogues. He has Socrates kind of say the thing that Plato believes is actually true. So now we read a bit of Republic, so that would be one place you might think you're seeing this kind of cliche happening. In Plato's case, it's a little bit complicated because Plato was very influenced by Socrates, and so the reason Plato thinks those things may be because Socrates thought them first. But Socrates always comes across really, really well in Plato's dialogues and looks a bit too kind of perfectly crafted as a stand-in for everything the author thinks is good and right and what a good, cool philosopher would be like. The other example of this, or one other example of this that you might think we've seen, is the character of Roquentin in Sartre's Nausea, where it really seems like, one guy, Sartre, who is experiencing existential feelings and then writing a novel about them, writes about another guy, Roquentin, who's experiencing existential feelings and then writes a novel about them. So you can kind of see how the identification of Roquentin with Sartre, I'm not saying everything that happens to one happened to the other, but there's a fairly obvious sense in which Roquentin is kind of Sartre's alter ego inside the text. And lots of other sort of less famous or less perhaps highly esteemed fiction will also do this kind of thing where one of the characters is just obviously saying the thing that's right and true and that the audience will agree with, and it is kind of just a representative of the author's own viewpoint. So again, now that putting a character like that into a piece of philosophical writing is a cliche, but it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means if you're going to do it, you might want to twist it somehow. Maybe you have your mouthpiece or your stand-in for yourself in your fiction. Do something that's actually pretty awful or outrageous or unexpected at one point, just to kind of break the mold. Or maybe you have, more interestingly, you kind of divide up the things you think are actually right and true amongst several characters and then just sort of set them all off against each other to fight it out. So there are ways of manipulating or massaging the cliche so that you don't just do the really obvious thing. But you want to be aware of the cliche so that you can play with it. And, if you're going to do it, you can decide to do it with awareness rather than just by accident. Okay, third cliche, the after school special. So now this is a kind of genre of, I guess originally TV content where some scenario plays out, and then one of the characters in effect kind of breaks the fourth wall and says, so remember kids, and then, delivers some sort of patronizing message like don't do drugs or don't bully other children or whatever the thing is. But so it's not quite a fable with a moral because there's this whole sort of section of it where the scenario is being set up in a way where you're supposed to kind of identify yourself into the scenario, and at the end you're being addressed in this kind of like, so chummy peer fellow teenager, let's not do this thing, hey? So it's not quite like a fable, which is more didactic and kind of like something that a child will tell to a parent would tell to a child, an adult would tell to a child. The after school special is kind of this attempt at a feeling of camaraderie with the audience, like we're all on the same level, right? But also I am going to tell you what you should do or not do. So it has that kind of different tone. Some people interpret a lot of Star Trek episodes as having that kind of feel to them, where there's a sort of patronizing quality to the delivery of the moral content or the philosophical content, that sort of, in effect, it speaks down to the audience by not really taking them seriously as complicated moral thinkers. So that's the after school special cliche. Now Star Trek, in some ways, it's a complicated case of this. So when I said lots of people think Star Trek does this, some people also think Star Trek is better than that. And myself, I tend to think some of the episodes are worse than others as far as this cliche goes. So I actually gave us the episode Measure of a Man, which I think is one of the stronger episodes. It's less inclined towards that cliche mode of delivery that's quite patronizing to the audience, and more complex and has a little bit more, there's just a bit more going on. But some other episodes of Star Trek can come across as a little bit after school special. So again, you don't necessarily have to avoid doing anything at all like that, but I mean, I think it really is good to avoid the patronizing tone that really puts people off anything that falls into this cliche. So how do we avoid patronizing readers? The most important part of that is trying to imagine that the readers you're aiming to speak to are complicated and interesting and multi-dimensional human beings. And this is actually part of a more general way of thinking about who your audience is that we're going to come back to. Actually, I think that is the third of these weeks on writing. I'll talk more about who you're writing for. But for now, for understanding this particular cliche, it's important to think about who you're writing for as, just be careful we're not patronizing our audience. I guess that's the main point of it. Okay, so then cliche number 4 was angsty existentialism. And now, so nausea again is one of the fairly classic cases of doing this. And when Sartre writes nausea, it's less of a cliche because, he is creating this genre of literature, co-creating with some other people. But if we were to now sit down and write something that looked just like nausea, we'd be writing a cliche because we'd be rewriting this sort of existential, angsty, troubled, turbulent, inner monologue style fiction, which is now very familiar and kind of overworked. Now, so again, like with all of the cliches, it doesn't mean we can't write angsty existentialist fiction, but it means we would have to find ways of making it fresh or making it new. So we would have to find ways of maybe twisting that mode of writing, or maybe doing something that makes it unexpected, like perhaps there's a frame dialogue that makes the main angsty existentialist part appear in a very different light. So maybe you end up with, you at the end of that angsty inner monologue, you zoom out and suddenly you realize it's all coming from a very different place than what you expected, or something like that. Lots of ways you could approach this, both in terms of the actual content and in terms of the formal qualities of the writing. So things like having a frame which enables you to view the angsty text differently. Lots of ways you could do this, but the main thing is just to be aware that this is a cliche, and so if you want to go that route, you need to be aware of that. You need to know that it's a cliche, and in order to make your own writing interesting and attention-grabbing and compelling, you'd need to do something with the cliche that goes beyond it in some way. Okay, so there we go. There's my 4 cliches: Fable, character is an obvious mouthpiece, after school special, and angsty existentialism. Like I said, those are not the only 4 cliches of philosophical writing that exist, of philosophical literature rather, that exist, but I think therefore that it's a very good starting kit to bear in mind when we start to write philosophical texts ourselves. So speaking of writing ourselves, this week's exercise or writing prompt is very short, so I'm going to keep everyone to a maximum of 55 words, which is sometimes called nanofiction. So you're writing a very, very short story. 55 words is the upper limit. You can write shorter if you want. If you can do your story with 4 words, awesome. But you can have up to 55. And I'm going to put some links on Canvas to where you can see examples of this form. So people writing these very, very short, very tight fictions, just to give you a kind of a sense of what it feels like. And I'm also I'm doing the prompts along with the class, so I'm going to post mine up on the Canvas discussion boards as well. And very important, what we're going to all agree just for this week is we're all going to agree not to judge at this stage. And what I mean by that is we're all going to be posting our story, and this is not the time for critiquing each other. That will come, but later. For this week, I just want people to feel really free to go with whatever they want and play around and try stuff out without worrying about other people weighing in and telling them that they did it wrong. So for this week, there is no doing it wrong. Doesn't matter what you do. As long as you've got 55 words and you meet the other criteria, which I'm about to set out, that's fine, cool. Just play within those confines and do what you like. So the other criteria are that you're going to start. So this is more really just to get you started and hopefully give you something to think about and work with. Choose a cliche of philosophical literature. So you can choose one of the 4 that I was just describing, or if you know of others, and you may well have noticed others as we were going through this course, you can choose your own as well if you want. But although if you do that, please tell us what it is, because then we can all learn from you. So choose a cliche of philosophical literature, and then mess with it. You have 55 words. You're going to mess with a philosophical literary cliche. So like I said, I'll post my example so you can see what I came up with. I just did it this morning. I didn't put a title on mine. If you want, you can, but you don't have to choose a title. Although if you do have a title, you can only have a 2-word title, because or up to 2 words, because there's to be no cheating by packing loads of words into the title so that you get way more than 55 in total. So 55 for the content and up to 2 for the title. But you can just leave it without a title as well. That's fine. Titles are actually really hard, so you don't have to worry about that, at least not for now. But as you're creating your 55 words, as you're crafting your 55 words, I want people to think about what you admired in the text that we studied. All right, so if you really liked Borges's short story, think about what was it about Borges's writing that really kind of did it for you, and see how you can incorporate elements of that into your 55 words. Or if there's something you really hated, like maybe if you really hated that Star Trek episode, just be like, okay, so I'm going to really make sure I don't do anything like that in my piece. And then the only other piece of advice that I'll give at this stage is to think about when you're writing, 55 words is a good length because it enables you to see things at 3 different scales. You can easily survey the entire thing because it's so short. So that's one scale. Then there's the scale of each individual sentence, which is really important when you're trying to write creatively. Each individual sentence has its own kind of flow and rhythm and structure. Some are short, some are long, some are simple, some are complicated. You might want to think about having all of your sentences have a very similar rhythm, or you might want to very deliberately change up the rhythm. All depends on how you're building your overall piece, but the sentence structure and the sentence rhythms, either way, are really important. So the whole thing, the level of the sentence, and then the third scale is the individual word choices. And because you only have 55 words, you get a little bit of time to think about each one of those really carefully. And so that's my last piece of advice. Think about it at those 3 different scales. And remember, we're all agreeing not to judge each other's writing this week. We're just putting it up there. We're going to make something. We're going to put it up on Canvas. Compliments are fine. You know, if you're like, oh, I really enjoyed that, that's cool. But you don't have to. And if nobody says anything about your story, it doesn't mean everyone hates it. It just means, you know, we're all busy and we don't all have time to compliment everything that we've seen and liked. But no critiques, not yet. This is not the time. We will learn more about how to critique each other's writing later. 55 words is not much, but some people might want to spend quite a bit of time just doing one of these stories, and that is absolutely fine. If, on the other hand, you find that you just get into a groove and you want to do several, that's also fine, and feel free to put multiple stories on Canvas. I'm not preventing that at all, but the main thing is that each one should stick to these limits. So I'm also going to, when I open the Canvas threads, I guess I'll just put them all in one thread for this week, because it's all the same thing. What I'm going to do is put those criteria and guidelines into the section underneath the title of the thread, so you don't have to remember everything from what I've just been saying right now. I'm going to put the task, as it were, task description onto Canvas, so you'll be able to get it from right there. I'm really excited about this part of the course. This is also quite a new and unusual thing to be doing in a philosophy class, but I'm hoping that it will enable us to not only to develop our own new writing skills, which are pretty useful in almost every area of life, but also to be able to understand other people's texts from a different angle. So when you try to do something yourself, it gives you a new perspective on, I think, it gives you a new perspective on what it was like for the people trying to make those things that we've been studying. So part of the purpose of creating these ourselves is the pure creative value of doing so, but part of it is also appreciation, and I think those two things very much play in tandem with one another. So by appreciating what we liked or didn't like in other people's work, we learn about how to create our own. By creating our own, we'll get a new and different appreciation of other people's work. All right, so that's it. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody creates this week, and I'll be back to chat about it on Friday in the wrap-up audio.